Hello, welcome for our science lesson today, and we are going to look at the global effects of modern humans on the atmosphere. Specifically, we have to look on those effects that have been attributed from the global perspective that emanate from human on the atmosphere. You have to remember that there are various effects of human on the atmosphere, especially planet Earth. With our increasing and the growing population, our use of science and technology has been bringing a lot of impact on planet. Therefore, the planet Earth has been increased, especially in terms of the impact of human. And these impacts have become a global issue. Therefore, we'll be addressing some of these issues from the global perspective. And then when we look at that, we'll be able to look at these effects that are emanating to the atmosphere. But before we are able to understand these global effects actually on planet Earth, we'll have to take a study on the aspect of the atmosphere. Therefore, we have to look at the atmosphere. We have to look at the atmosphere. When we'll be looking at the atmosphere, then we are in a position to understand where are these effects of human affecting the atmosphere, specifically which site or which area of the atmosphere, and what are its impacts, so that the impact of the human on the atmosphere becomes a global issue. First of all, we need to understand what is an atmosphere. When we look at the atmosphere makes our planet very unique. It makes it a unique planet. Why? Because the atmosphere provides us with the weather, and the atmosphere also protects the biosphere from the sun damage. And some of the most extensive, but they are very least and visible impact emanates from human. It is actually human impact on the atmosphere. They are very least, but they are very extensive. They are least visible. You cannot see the impact of human on the atmosphere. That is why it has, with the time, it has brought us to the limelight on the attention of the atmosphere. Because atmosphere is very important on planet Earth. It protects the biosphere, as now you know. In addition to that, as it does that, it protects the human life or the biosphere in general from the damage of the sun. Therefore, this will bring us to a series of lessons that we are going to explore throughout this session. Therefore, the atmosphere is an external layer of odorless gas where weather elements are found. As you know, the Earth is the only planet in the solar system with an atmosphere. Therefore, the atmosphere becomes a unique substance that makes the planet Earth. as we were able to look at the structure of the earth, within the structure of the earth, we were able to look at the internal structure of the earth, and now we have come to look at the external structure of the earth. The external structure of the earth is actually simply means the atmosphere. Away from the internal structure, now we are going to concentrate on the structure of the atmosphere. Actually, what is it made of? What is this atmosphere? As we have been able to see, it is a layer of external and odorless gases that are occupying a space that is in the atmosphere. But specifically, what is it made up of? And what is the importance of the substances or the compositions that are there in the atmosphere? Now, the layer of these gases is actually comprises of the air. It comprises of the air. Sometimes we call it space, but space is not the right attribute scientifically to call the atmosphere. Why? Because in the atmosphere, it is actually a series of layers that are composed of the air. But now we have to look at these gases that are comprised of the air. The layer of gases comprised of the air, it has various composition which are always at a given constant. For example, the atmosphere or the air is made up of various gases, and these gases are the one that makes up the air. One, we have nitrogen gas. You have to remember that one, and it is placed at a percentage of 78. And then we also have oxygen. Oxygen is placed at a constant of 21% of the air. Then we have other gas such as argon, which comprises of 0.93%. Then we have carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide gas comprises of 0.04%. Others, it ranges between 0.04 or 0.03%. And then other gases such as, we have other gases such as helium and hydrogen. All of these, their percentage is actually placed at 1. Other gases such as helium and hydrogen, their quantity of we can quantify their percentage as to 1%. Therefore, this is the composition of the air. And when we study closely the atmosphere, we'll be able to find this as part of it. But an atmosphere is made up of a series of layers. We will discover that the atmosphere is made up of several layers, and these layers are the one that plays a very important role. Let's look at the layers that makes up the atmosphere. the layers that makes up the atmosphere. Our planet Earth, or the Earth's atmosphere, is subdivided into 5 main layers. And these layers have different roles and different content they play in the atmosphere. These layers include, we have the troposphere. That is the first layer. And then the second one is the stratosphere. And then the third layer we have is the mesosphere. The fourth layer is called the thermosphere. And the last one, the one that merges into the outer space, is referred to the exosphere. These are the layers that we are going to look at it separately and find out what do they contain in the atmosphere. And therefore, we shall be able to summarize up with the structure of the atmosphere, and we look at how human or modern human effects have become and how do they affect the atmosphere. Therefore, we have the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, the thermosphere, and the exosphere. We are going to look at each of them and what do they have. Let's look at the troposphere. Each of these layers have got distinct features or characteristics. What characteristic does the troposphere have? The troposphere, when we understand, is the closest layer to the Earth's surface. When we are in contact on Earth's surface, for example, where you are standing or where you sit and where the house is built is on the surface of the earth. And then immediately after the surface of the earth, we have a layer that is referred to as the troposphere. And this layer, it extends to about 7 to 20 kilometers. This layer extends to about 7 to around 20 kilometers. That is the first attributes or some of the characteristics that it has. And this is its thickness. It extends to a thickness of about 7 to 20 kilometers of thickness. And it contains some of the weather elements. Most of the weather elements can easily be found on the troposphere. These elements are the ones that determines the temperature. Therefore, they warms the lower atmosphere. They warms up. Actually, what they do, these weather elements, they warms up the atmosphere in general, so that in a given region, you will find that the atmosphere exhibits a particular temperature. actually when we'll be able to look at the climate, or maybe when we'll be studying about the weather elements and climate, we'll be able to find out the significance of the troposphere. As it warms up the atmosphere, most of it, specifically the regions that it warms up, it warms the ground, the regions that are near to the ground. And that is why the temperature of a given region is placed at a constant. Though it varies with the topography of the land, or it varies with how the land is oriented, but some of these weather characteristics are found here. It is also made up of most dust particles that makes up the clouds. There are dust particles and water vapor. The water vapor are found in this particular layer of the atmosphere that lead to the formation of the clouds. Actually, these dust particles and the water vapor, when they reaches a particular level, you'll find that the clouds will be formed. We shall be looking at that one when we'll be looking at the climate or weather, when we'll be studying about the global climate in the next level. This is much information concerning the troposphere. And the troposphere is made up also of a transition layer. There is a thin transition layer that is constant, that it transits the troposphere into the next layer. That very thin layer of transition is referred to as tropopause. Just from the word itself, this layer is very important because it is a transition layer. Sometimes it is also called a layer of discontinuity. This layer transits the troposphere to the next layer, and that is the stratosphere. Why is it called the tropopause? This transition layer separates the troposphere and it marks up the warming up effect of the ground so as the temperature is maintained at a low level. And as you move higher, you will find that the temperatures become to reduce. Therefore, let's look at the second layer of the atmosphere. And that becomes the stratosphere. The stratosphere is the second layer after the troposphere. It is actually immediately placed above the troposphere. This layer extends from, that is about 20 to 50 kilometers thickness. That is above the first layer. Therefore, what we are finding out here, that the distance between 20 to 50 kilometers of thickness, that is approximately 30 kilometers or approximately 60 miles. And when we look at the thickness that is extend This also, to a given level, it may be a curvature from the ground that is now above the ground. Because in some given areas, the thickness varies according to the orientation of the topography of the land. This layer contains the ozone layer. The stratosphere contains what we call the ozone layer. And ozone layer is an important layer of the atmosphere. It is embedded in the troposphere. Having this layer, scientifically, it has 3 oxygen elements. The ozone layer has 3 oxygen molecules that is always saturated within the stratosphere. And this is a band of oxygen molecules which have been saturated, and it plays a very important role on the biosphere. Why? This band of layers, it filters excess ultraviolet rays radiation. It filters the excess ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth's surface. And once these ultraviolet radiation are filtered, they remain to be less harmful unless the radiations are filtered out by a very important layer, that is ozone layer. Then we will have harmful effects will be experienced on the Earth's surface. Alongside that, it also plays an important role of protecting the biosphere. This layer protects the biosphere from sun damage. We'll be able to look at the sun specifically as one of the celestial body or in the solar system in the next lesson, so that we understand how this ultraviolet radiation reaches the atmosphere and then plays a very important segment on the planet Earth. These ozone layers having played a very important role of filtering the harmful radiation from the sun, it also protects the biosphere against destruction. Then the air around it is very thin and dry. It has a thin air that is dry. And because it is very thin and dry, most of the jet aircraft and space station, or we call them the space shuttles, can also be found in this layer that is above the stratosphere. And that is where most of the jet aircraft and the weather balloons fly above this layer. Why? Because the air is thin and it's very dry. Therefore, the rate of friction becomes less dense, and therefore the weather balloon can float comfortable above the stratosphere. That is much more of the features and much more of the information concerning the stratosphere. Therefore, we are identifying this is an important segment, layer of the atmosphere. Therefore, it is quite very important we look at it. Let's move to the next layer. But before we move on the next layer, that is the third layer, there is a thin transition discontinuity that also separates the stratosphere into the mesosphere. That transition is referred to as the stratopause. It is in this layer that the temperatures now begin to increase with an increase in altitude. Therefore, that is where now we maintain a characteristic of the dryness. And therefore, the temperature begin to increase within the stratopause, showing that we are transiting from the stratosphere, we are transiting into the mesosphere. Now, let's look at the mesosphere as the third layer of the atmosphere. The mesosphere is the third layer of the atmosphere after the stratosphere. This layer extends to about 50 to around 85 kilometers above the ground. Therefore, it has a thickness of around 50 to 85 kilometers, depending with the topography of the land, because we cannot completely take the constant value above the sea level, but we take the value above the ground, because there are some other areas that are high altitude regions. We also have the middle altitude regions and the very low altitude regions. Therefore, that is why we provide a range of this value that will be able to accommodate both the highlands, the middle or the mid latitudes, and the lowland regions. That is according to the topography of the land. Therefore, this layer is also comprised of the coldest parts of the atmosphere. When you move in this layer, you'll find that it is very cold. Why is it cold? Because on top of it, on top of the mesosphere, there is a thin layer that is called mesopause. This thin layer is the one that keeps the temperature to be very cold, and therefore making the mesosphere to be the coldest layer of the atmosphere, which makes the whole atmosphere to experience some cold with an average temperature ranging, that is an average temperature of around 130 degrees Fahrenheit. When we subtract 90 degrees, we'll be able to get a very low temperatures here. It is known that most of the matters, those are some of the heavenly bodies, most of the matters. From the scientist point of view, the matters are always burning up in this layer of the mesosphere. Why? Because the thickness of this very cold part of the atmosphere, when it encounters with the matters, there is a high friction that produces a burning energy. Therefore, when matters fall into the mesosphere, they will burn up completely as a result of a higher friction that is generated from the very cold air. That is much about the mesosphere. Therefore, this thin layer, that is transition layer, or it's also called a layer of discontinuity, that's referred to as mesopause. This is a layer that transits or bring transition from the mesosphere into the thermosphere as the fourth layer. And it is the one that marks the cold part of the mesosphere. And something that is very important here, you'll be able to understand that in a given constant, as you rise up above the mesosphere, the temperatures remains now constant. In a given layer, for example, the stratosphere, as you go high, the temperature becomes cold. Therefore, there is those characteristics and which is produced in these several layers of the atmosphere. We referred to it as a lapse rate. Let's look at the fourth layer, that is the thermosphere. The thermosphere extends up to around a thickness of 500 to 1,000, that is kilometers, thickness above the ground. That is a range of between 310 to approximately 620 miles. And here the temperatures increases with the increase in height. Temperature increases with an increase in height. Or with an increase in altitude. When you rise higher, the temperature increases when you rise in altitude. Now it changes the notion of when you go high, it becomes cold. Therefore, what is increasing here? The temperature is increasing with an increasing altitude. Therefore, this phenomena, we referred to it as a lapse rate. Is referred to as a lapse rate. To a given perspective, there is an average temperature in the thermosphere. It's actually extremely hot because temperatures are increasing up to around 1,500 degrees Celsius. This is approximately about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a very high temperature within the layer of the atmosphere, especially it is found within the thermosphere. And that is why it is referred to as thermosphere. Therefore, the word thermo means heat, Therefore, there is a high temperature here as compared to the other layers of the atmosphere. This is the reason why, because of having a high temperature, most of the space shuttles also flew around here, and it is also where the international space stations such as the satellites orbit the Earth. We can be able to find most of the satellites and other international station points. They are orbiting the Earth. Most of the satellites orbit the Earth here, and the other international space or international shuttles that gather information, especially the satellites. Remember, we covered various altitude of satellites. Also, in the layer of the atmosphere, in this layer, there occurs various changes, such as aurora. And aurora is a change that emanates from the charged particles from the space colliding with the atoms and molecules that are found in the atmosphere. Most of these charged particles, as they meet, therefore they bring drastic change around this region. And in Australia, there is a scientist who was able to discover this existing change that actually produces a higher energy that excites the state of photons to produce much more energy. Actually, higher energy that is exerted, that is actually excited by photons. In the space, in Australia, we have it is aurora. We refer to it as aurora borealis. And aurora australis. This gives us an idea that we have scientists who have also been very careful to study this layer of the atmosphere that is referred to as the thermosphere. Therefore, also this layer, as we move yonder, there is a thin layer of discontinuity that separates this layer into the next layer, and this layer is referred to as thermopause. Because of its nature, this is the one that gives the thermosphere a very high temperature characteristic. Very high temperature characteristic is the one that is found here, because in this layer we'll find that there are excitingly very high temperature as we find them out. From the thermopause, we will be able to move to the next layer that is referred to the exosphere. That is the fifth layer. The exosphere. Exosphere is the fifth layer immediately after the thermosphere. It extends up to a thickness of around 10,000 kilometers. That is above the ground. Which is approximately 6,200 miles. As we find it out, the exosphere is the highest layer in the atmosphere that is extremely very thin, and it provides an aspect where the atmosphere merges the outer space. Therefore, it is this layer that provides an element of the atmosphere merging into the outer space, and it is composed of very widely dispersed particles. There are wide and dispersed particles of hydrogen and helium. The particles of hydrogen and helium are widely dispersed, and they are found in the exosphere. It is these hydrogen and helium particles, when they are charged also in this, they tend to bring in another layer of charged particles that is referred to as ionosphere, but it's not mostly regarded as a layer of the atmosphere, because at a given rate it changes with the charged particles. When those particles of hydrogen and helium are charged, that is where most auroras also happen, and the process where some of the scientists tend to refer to it as ionosphere, though it is the exosphere which merges the atmosphere to the outer space. Therefore, anything beyond the exosphere is the outer space as it merges it. Therefore, it is a protective element that marks the end of the structure of the atmosphere. Any other thing, we go into the outer space, we'll be able to find other heavenly bodies such as the moon, and also other heavenly bodies that also orbit the sun, such as the comet. We can also have other heavenly bodies that are also embedded between the planet Mars and Jupiter. We will also be able to move into the next, that is the next outer space, that will find another planet. The second planet, the third planet, that is the fourth planet after the atmosphere. It becomes planet Mars, and in between Mars and also that is Jupiter, we have other heavenly bodies that rotate there. Having looked at this part of the atmosphere, then we will be able to find out that in the exosphere there is a composed of ionosphere, which is abundant layer of electrons also. Abundant layer of electrons. These electrons tend to make this layer to be referred to as ionosphere, because these charged electrons, they are ionized atoms and molecules that makes this region very dynamic, and it grows and shrinks basing on the solar condition, or that is actually the solar condition of the earth. It grows and shrinks. As it shrinks based on the solar conditions of that particular area or that particular part of the atmosphere. Why? As it shrinks, we'll find that when we look carefully at planet Earth, we can again subdivide it into the North Pole and South Pole. And during the revolution of the Earth or around the Sun, we learned in the previous lessons that one of the effects of this movement of revolving around the Sun, it produces seasons. And these seasons are the ones that makes either this abundant layer of electrons, ionosphere, to grow and shrinks basing on the solar radiation or the solar insolation, because in different seasons the planet Earth is exposed on different solar radiation, and that makes it either to grow and shrink in various aspects. This will bring us to the attention that we'll be able to summarize this aspect on our chart as we look at it, the final structure of the atmosphere and how it looks like. When we look at the structure of the atmosphere, this is able to summarize the all aspects of the structure of the atmosphere, and we have been able to find out that it is made up of a series of layers. When you look at the first layer, that is from the Earth's surface, this represents the Earth's surface, and this is a scale that provides the temperature. I'll use the word T to denote temperature here so that we are able to know. Therefore, the first layer that we encounter immediately after the Earth's surface is the troposphere. This troposphere extends to a thickness of around 7 to 20 kilometers. This is a distance in altitude. I will denote it here. This altitude is in kilometers. I've used the standard part. Therefore, we'll have the troposphere, and there is a thin layer of transition that always transits from the stratosphere, from the troposphere to the stratosphere. This layer, I am marking it G. Therefore, this layer, we refer to it as the stratopause. It is very thin layer of transition that actually transits the troposphere into the stratosphere. And when we are transiting from the troposphere to the stratosphere, you will find that As you rise up, the temperature tends to remain constant shortly. There is a constant change of temperature here. But now when you enter into the stratosphere, you'll find that the temperature is decreasing. And this decreasing aspect of temperature with an increase in altitude, you will find this is the real aspect that explain as you rise high, it becomes cool. And the higher you go, the cooler it becomes. This phenomena is only found in the stratosphere. But when you go in the stratosphere, you'll be able to have found out that the stratosphere also houses a layer of ozone. Ozone layer is found here, and I explained an ozone layer being found in the stratosphere. It plays a very important role. This role here is to filter the harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the biosphere on Earth's surface. Remember, on Earth's surface, we have the biosphere, include the life. That is, we have plants, animals. All aspects of flora and fauna are found on the Earth's surface. Can it be on the land or in the water bodies? Therefore, the ozone layer plays a very important role here. And that is also why some of the weather elements happens here are very crucial. From the stratosphere, we also have a very thin layer. I will refer to it as Q. This thin layer of discontinuity, of transition that transit the stratosphere into the mesosphere, scientifically it is referred to as stratopause. Okay, this is not stratopause. This is the one that is referred to as stratopause. This is tropopause. We will make that correction. It is tropopause. And then this becomes stratopause. Stratopause. Yes, because it separates the stratosphere into the mesosphere. That is why it carries the name of the second layer of the atmosphere. And that becomes stratopause. When we head into the mesosphere, you will find that temperatures are reducing. Temperatures are decreasing when you rise up. Also, another aspect, the higher you go, the cooler it becomes. But when you enter into the thermosphere, there is also another thin layer of transition. I will call it aura. This layer is mesopause. This layer is referred to as mesopause, and transiting the mesosphere into the thermosphere. And remember, in the thermosphere, where there is a high collision of molecules that produces or excites the phantom energy, photons energy, that makes this layer to be extremely having a high temperature, referring to it as a thermosphere. And then it is in this layer of discontinuity, I will denote it as Z. That is the one that have the very high temperature. This layer is referred to as the thermopause. The thermopause. And then thermopause will transit into the outer space that is referred to as exosphere. Therefore, this becomes the summarized point of the structure of the atmosphere. As we look at it very careful, it is very important. Now, After understanding various layers of the atmosphere, we have to begin from the Earth's surface as we go high. That is the order. We have the troposphere, stratosphere, the mesosphere, thermosphere, and the exosphere. Remember where the elements of ionosphere are found because of the charged electrons that are always moving in this. They try to ionize this layer, and as this layer is ionized, we find out that it tends to give another new characteristic, or tend to bring out another seemingly different layer, but it remains to be exosphere, although we may have a variation of the name, as ionosphere can also mean the exosphere. Although exosphere is the appropriate word because it provides a merging zone where the atmosphere merges into the outer space as a boundary of the structure of the atmosphere. This is much more about the structure of the atmosphere, and as we have been able to look at it, then we are seriously going to look at now the modern impact on the atmosphere now. Specifically, what will the impact of human on this structure of the atmosphere? And then what will be the subsequent global effect as we are able to move into the next lesson. Now, as a matter of winding up this aspect or this part, I would like to give us some few questions that we are going to help us understand the concept of the atmosphere. These are just some questions to help us review, and I will give us this question. Identify the major layers of the atmosphere. And then the second question, list down the transition layer. Between the atmosphere. And then my third question, which is the last, I will have to state the importance of the ozone layer. As a matter of reviewing our concept here, this is a question that I will give you for homework, so that when we meet in the next lesson, we'll have to review them. Identify the major layers of the atmosphere, and then list down the transition layer between the atmosphere, and then state the importance of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. With those very few remarks, I wish you a good day. Thank you. We shall proceed in the next lesson.